Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure. It's a real big pleasure to introduce to you Professor Yves Winkin. It's also an honor for me to get to know him in person, even if just online. Professor Yves Winkin is an important, really an eminent researcher and also a professor of anthropology, who was born in Belgium in 1953, and who is now he has now retired. He retired from university in 2019. And he has been a very important, a decisive author to introduce to the Francophone world to lots of really important streams of the social sciences and human social sciences from the United States. And he actually integrated these references, especially Erving Goffman, who is our major author in this seminar, and also authors like the Gregory Bateson, into something that he coined as an anthropology of communication, and which is founded, whose main epistemological, not only methodological basis is ethnography. Yes, and so ethnography as really being methodologically crucial, which it is for anthropologists, but also as a way of getting to know, of knowing communication and getting to understand communication. Indeed, he has been and is professor at the University of Liège, and afterwards he became he also was a professor at the École Normale Supérieure de Lyon, and last but not least, he's worked at the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers à Paris, in Paris. And he was also a director of the Musée des Arts et Métiers from 2015 to 2019. He has also been invited to teach in many different foreign universities. So he was visiting professor at Wisconsin Parkside, as l'Université du Québec à Montréal, at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, where he actually was invited to do that by Pierre Bourdieu too, in one of his stays there. He was also at the University of Berkeley, the Berkeley University in California, University of Genève, and also Messi, the Brazilian Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Pennsylvania. Also, he's also been in the African continent. He was at the Université de la Réunion, and also he's also been in China too. So actually, we are facing an anthropologist who's traveled all over the world through the fall. He has crossed the world from east to the west, from the north to the south, and whose major subject of study and of interest, of research, have been, and I would like to briefly address them. No? First of all, what I've mentioned before, a kind of the sociology of communication, no? In which Professor Winkin, indeed, he innovated the debate based on his interface or his dialogue with the North American, not only North American, but Anglo-Saxon in general, authors who work on non-verbal communication, which is a specific area of study. And he actually innovated that debate by proposing something he called a new communication. Actually, this book, which is called The New Communication, it was La Nouvelle Communication. It was published in 1981, and it was even translated into Portuguese in the 1990s. With the aid exactly a nova comunicação, he is showing the book, and the person who really, the author, the anthropologist who was important and really crucial for making Yves Winkin's thought about communication known in Brazil, it was and is Professor Etienne Samin, also a Belgian. He has been professor of the State University of Campinas, Unicamp, and we are very pleased to have him here too. He is joining our meeting today, and actually, what Professor Yves Winkin did, as far as I understand, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Yves Winkin, is that he proposed that we are facing a new kind of communication in this late 20th century, because instead of having this kind of communication dynamics based on message by one emissary and the public, so this kind of telegraphic, the telegraphic communication, this metaphor of the telegraph, what we have been facing since the late 20th century would be the orchestra as a metaphor for the kind of communications logics that we have been facing in more recently in our world. And in the orchestra is a metaphor for the way non-communication and non-verbal communication and verbal communication intermingle and complement each other. Yeah, this is first, in my opinion, this was actually the field of study that led Professor Winkin to get in touch and to start deepening up his knowledge about our major author, which is Erving Goffman, which Professor Winkin indeed started to study his Goffman's work in the 1980s, and I would really say that he is perhaps the major, well, at least one of the major authors who addressed what it would be to have or to do or kind of think Goffman's trajectory in a biographical way. Yes, he has been following Goffman step by step, really going to the places where Goffman did research, from Goffman's beginning as a sociologist, anthropologist in the island of Unst, and also the hospital, St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, where Goffman has researched. So also the casinos of Las Vegas and where Goffman and Reno, where Goffman has also worked. And he has also indeed published based on this long research on Goffman. He has published a book which is called in French Les Moments et leurs hommes, which is actually a quotation of Goffman's introduction to Intellectual Ritual, this book from 1967, and which indeed was inclusively it was inclusively translated into Portuguese, but Português de Portugal, Portugal's Portuguese. In when was it exactly, Mr. Winkin? I think it was, let me just
99.
99, yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
And apart from this, I will not. This is actually our major issue here today. Professor Winkin's way of addressing Goffman's work and Goffman as a personality. But I would just finish very quickly by pointing out that Professor Winkin has also evolved and a specific way of addressing what he calls an anthropology of enchantment, of what it means actually in order to a specific way of addressing the way people use public spaces in our times, and also in this context a specific work on really walking in the streets, the pedestrian, which is also one of my issues of attention, of research, and it's a very nice, and all of this obviously has points of contact with Goffman's work. And last but not least, I would like to mention, just for everyone who's joining us and who perhaps wants to know more about Professor Winkin's work, it's important to mention his activity, his very active engagement in the world of museums, what it means to what is museology in our times, what are the different dynamics in museums, that we should not think of, oh, okay, let's conceive of specific dynamics of museums in general. You should consider the different publics. And I think this I hope this conveys a broad panorama about Professor Winkin's very multifaceted interests in the areas of anthropology and also of sociology. So Professor Winkin, it's an enormous pleasure for me to open the floor for you to give your talk about Goffman, Bourdieu, and biography, which is the issue today. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much, Freya. Well, thank you, first of all, for, I would say, setting up the event, because I didn't know how we were going to finally meet, and we do meet tonight. Thanks to you. Thanks to you also. I have the pleasure to meet Etienne Sama. Oh my God, we have been missing each other for the last, 20 years. And I'm so happy that Etienne is now with us tonight, and maybe we'll have the chance to talk together later during the talking part.
Yeah.
What I would like to do is to try not to tell Goffman's life.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe people in the audience, and I don't see the audience tonight. I only see you, Freya, and I just see me. But you might remember that I came to Brazil twice. You mentioned Rio de Janeiro, and I even went to Brasilia, etc. And also, thanks to Etienne Sama, I gave a few talks at Unicamp. And in just about every university in Brazil I visited, I gave a talk about Goffman's life. So I thought that today I was not going to rehash Goffman's life. I was going to take a step above and try to lead you into reconsidering what is a biography. And in order to critically discuss what a biography ought to be in the history and sociology of the social sciences, I ask, Saint-Pierre Bourdieu to intervene and be a critical assessor of what a biography is. And I will tap into his 1986 paper called, you might know it, The Biographical Illusion. Okay, so let me get back to my paper, and thank you for the interpreter, who might well have a hard time because I might still be speaking a bit too fast now, and I will slow down. In respect to his work, I will try to follow my paper, but sometime I have to admit I will jump out of it. So, thank you for the opportunity, first of all, to discuss what a biography in the social sciences ought to be. You know that biography is everywhere, in bookshops, everywhere. It's a very well established narrative genre in nonfiction, we might say. But when we consider more specifically what a biography in the history and the sociology of science has to be, it's not that much discussed. I mean, except for Bourdieu's paper, there are not that many major papers which try to argue that a biography of a social scientist like Erving Goffman cannot be similar to the biography, let's say, of a famous football player or any kind of star. I mean, sure, you might consider that the biography of a football player might be a document or a contribution to the sociology of social mobility or the sociology of sports. But this is not exactly the same as considering a biography of Emile Durkheim or Bateson or whomever in the social sciences. So my argument is that when we write the biography of a famous sociologist, anthropologist, linguist, whatever, and we try to write such a biography as a possible contribution to the history and sociology of sociology, we have to use the tools of reflexive sociology in order to construct our object. The biography in the social sciences cannot just jump at us. It is not just a photography of what happened in the life of so and so. It is not a simple assemblage of chronologically arranged data. And ultimately, the biographer in the social sciences has to be in control all the time of the biography. If you write the biography of this poor football player, at some point the biography is going to escape the biographer. It takes a life of its own, like a novel. But I would argue that in the case of a biography of, let's say, an Erving Goffman or a Durkheim, the sociologist or the historian of sociology writing the biography is in control all the times. In other words, a biography in the social sciences takes strong options. It's not a photography, as I just said. It suggests interpretative hypotheses on the basis of available data, a bit like biographies written by historians. But there may be a slight difference between biographies written by historians for the sake of contributing to historiography and biographies written by sociologists or anthropologists for the sake of contributing to the history of sociology or anthropology, in the sense that there is a long tradition in history of writing long narratives, like, let's say, the history of Napoleon. Well, you tell the life of Napoleon or Louis XV or whomever. It is admitted in the historical discipline. I would argue it is still not admitted to write such biographies in sociology or anthropology or history of sociology or anthropology. So, to make it short, I'm first going to tell you my different attempts at writing Goffman's biography. And along the way, I will discuss, through an excerpt, Bourdieu's objections to life histories, because Bourdieu strongly objected to biographies in a paper called, I already mentioned the title, The Biographical Illusion, 1986. As a response, then I will try to give you a hint at my own approach to biography, which is based on what I call snapshots, or that is short and dense narrative pieces, which might ultimately assemble as a puzzle. And finally, I will suggest a few new venues for completing that puzzles, and I will also try to suggest ways of reinforcing what we might call a theoretical platform for biographical construction in the social sciences. I don't need to give my sources here, but later possibly in the discussion, if you want me to quote or to give you references, please let me know. I will gladly oblige. So, first section, let's say, collecting data for a biography. Let me tell you how I came to get interested in writing a biography of Erving Goffman. So, yes, I wrote that book, La Nouvelle Communication. Freya nicely summarized the book. It was published in 1981, and thanks to Etienne Samin, it was then partially translated in Brazil a few years later. What I tried to do in that book was to offer portraits of American scholars in the field of communication. And then I thought, well, it would be nice to have what American publishing houses call portable Veblen, for example, or portable Durkheim. That means a few papers, let's say, by Durkheim, possibly a biographical introduction, plenty of references. So when a student wants to know what he needs to know about Durkheim, he has it in one single book. And I wanted to do the same for Goffman because, thanks to Bourdieu, Goffman was being translated into French, but nobody knew where he was coming from. And I thought that a biographical introduction was in demand. Then Goffman died, 1982. And I let the project sleep for a while. Then in 93, I got the chance, thanks to Wendy Leeds Hurwitz, who is in the audience, to come to her department at University of Wisconsin-Parkside for a semester. And I got the chance to talk at length with a sociologist named Hans Mauch, who knew Goffman from his Chicago years. They were together at the University of Chicago in the late 40s and early 50s. So I resumed the idea, I refurbished, I would say, the idea of building that portable Goffman. So I visited Gillian Sankoff, who was Goffman's widow and Goffman's literary executor, and I asked her the permission to work on a biography. And she said, no way. She would not forbid me to do research. For example, she was not going to call friends to say, don't talk to Winkin. No, she never did that. But she told me very explicitly that she wanted to respect her late husband's will, that there is a full separation between life and work, and life is not supposed to shed light on the work. Keep that separate. But if you want to go ahead, she said, go ahead. So I did. My position was, and still is today, that there's a difference between the private persona or character and the public persona. Once you decide to become a scholar in a given field, you necessarily end up with a public persona. And I was personally only interested in the public life of Erving Goffman, with the objective of an intellectual biography, which would shed light on the making of his work. I was not interested in any way in a psychological interpretation of his life. For a few years, a scholar at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Dimitri Shalin, has been working on a psychological biography of Erving Goffman, and he has been collecting papers and documents. You might know the Goffman archives. They are quite useful, but their objective, besides the fact that they make public a lot of documents which would have been hidden otherwise, is to contribute to a psychological biography of Erving Goffman. I'm not doing that. I'm more trying to set up Goffman in the field of sociology. So, over the years, I interviewed and taped about 100 colleagues and friends of Goffman. That was my first methods collecting interviews. The only member of his family that I met was his son, Tom, who actually urged Gillian to let me have access to the archives, but she declined. Okay, fine. Second methods. I spent time in, I would say, signifying places. That is, places that must have been meaningful for Erving Goffman. For example, the small community of Dauphin in Manitoba, where he grew up, then the much bigger town of Winnipeg, where he moved when he was a young adolescent, and he attended St. John's Technical High School, secondary high school. Then I also spent time at the University of Chicago in order to get an idea of what might have been Chicago in the late 40s and 50s. It did change a lot, but anyway, the buildings are still there. And as you know, Goffman got his master's and his PhD from Chicago. Then I also spent some time, about a week, on the island of Unst, where Goffman did his first major piece of fieldwork for his dissertation, a dissertation that was finally defended in 1953. Then I also spent 2 days, twice, one day, or not even one day, 2 afternoons, in St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the psychiatric hospital where Goffman spent about a year around 1955, nearby Washington, Bethesda. And then I spent time at University of California, Berkeley, in 1987. And as you know, Goffman taught there in the late 50s and 60s and until 68. So I got to meet quite a few of his colleagues who were still teaching there. And ultimately, I did spend time, both as a student and a scholar, at the University of Pennsylvania, where Erving Goffman taught from the late 60s to the end of his life in 82. Third stream, and it's very new for me, and I would say I owe that invitation again to Wendy Leeds Hurwitz. I have been starting to explore archives in different university libraries. Those archives have only been recently organized and open to scholars, and I'm discovering a few treasure troves. It's not over. I'm even finding photographs. As you know, possibly, Goffman hated to be photographed, but there are photographs here and there, well hidden in university archives, and I'm digging them out. Now, I have my data. What do I do with them? My first attempt at making sense of my data dates back from 1987, when I returned from a semester at the University of California, Berkeley, where I had, as I just said, the chance to meet a few of Goffman's colleagues. At that time, I was very much under the spell, under the influence, I would say, of a paper by Luc Boltanski. Luc Boltanski was one of the close colleagues for many years of Pierre Bourdieu. And Bourdieu in 72 or 73 asked him to write a preface for one of the translations that Bourdieu was setting up in his book series at the Édition de Minuit. Finally, that paper never turned out to be a preface. It was published in a journal. It's called Erving Goffman et le temps du soupçon. I don't know whether that is translated into English or Portuguese. And I'm going to read to you a small excerpt which was very influential in my thinking. That is the way I wanted to organize my data in a non-descriptive way. Yes, okay, we can have descriptions, but the ultimate goal is to contribute to the confirmation of a given hypothesis. And here is the hypothesis. And I read slowly. Well, dear translator, is that right for you so far? I don't know whether you hear me, but if you don't scream, I just keep going.
I'm not able to address him either, but let's hope it's okay.
I say está tranquilo, so that should be.
Yeah, está tranquilo now.
It's okay. Okay, fine then. Good. In order to understand the fundamental insight which underlies Goffman's work and which defines its particular perception of the social world, one should move upward in the genesis of the work, beyond the rather arbitrary moment when the work is objectified in the written code, and even beyond the time when, through a rational professional training, the author acquires the scientific habitus. So we have to move beyond that in order to reach the antecedent social experiences which constitute the class habitus. And Boltanski then explained, a scientific habitus is indeed never totally independent from the pre-existing class habitus upon which it is built, so that any scientific work always encapsulates, as any literary work, the trace of the social trajectory of its producer. Sorry for that. That's the way French scholars used to write in the 70s. It's better now, I think. But what I'm trying to say here is that through the data, I search for what we might call Goffman's class habitus, and on top of it, Goffman's scientific habitus. That is, what were his disposition? What were his habits, intellectual habits? And under his intellectual habits, what were his training, mental training, so to speak, that led him to become both socially and intellectually what he became? Okay, so to put it simply, my 1987 manuscript was framed by a search for Goffman's habitus. And I sent my manuscript to Pierre Bourdieu for comments, because I was getting fairly close to Bourdieu. And his reaction was, well, too much habitus and not enough field. And I will have to explain that in a minute. It was too late for me to radically change the manuscript, which was published in 1988 under the title Moments and Their Man, okay? And it got translated 10 years later in Portuguese in Lisbon under the title that I won't try to verbalize here. And as Freya nicely said, it is an excerpt from Goffman's final sentence of his Introduction to Interaction Rituals, 1967, not then men and their moments, rather moments and their man. And I thought it was very important to de-psychologize Goffman and re-sociologize Goffman, the moments before the man. The man jumped into the moments, the events waiting for them. But I fully understood what Bourdieu meant, not enough field. Because he had published, and I already alluded to that paper, he had published in 1986 a rather scathing criticism of life histories under the title L'illusion biographique, biographical illusion. And by the way, again, Wendy Leeds-Hurwitz, and I translated that paper from French to English. That was a nightmare, but anyway, we managed. Although he did not specifically address biographers working in the history of the social sciences, I consider that his vision of what a biography ought to be made a lot of sense to me. That is, still in the idea that a biography is not a given. It is well constructed, systematically constructed conceptually. I needed to tap into Bourdieu's criticisms, and I needed to answer somehow his criticisms in order to ultimately produce a biography for the social sciences. And here again, I'm going to read slowly a quotation from Bourdieu. There is a translation, not only in English, but also in Portuguese, but I'm sorry, you might not have had the time to find it. And let me write it slowly. Bourdieu says the following: trying to understand a life as a unique and self-sufficient series of successive events without and without ties other than the association to a subject whose constancy is probably just that of a proper name, is nearly as absurd as trying to make sense out of a subway route without taking into account the network structure. That is, the matrix of objective relations between different stations. And a bit further down, in other words, one can understand a trajectory, that is the social aging, which is independent of the biological aging, although it inevitably accompanies it. So let me jump the parenthesis. One can understand a trajectory only on condition of having previously constructed the successive states of the field through which the trajectory has progressed. That was the program, according to Bourdieu, to write a relevant biography. That is, not only the individual, because looking at the individual was just, like you were hopping from one place to the next without knowing why the guy was jumping from one place to the next. So you needed the matrix that the individual was actually following in order to have and to produce his trajectory. In other words, that meant that I needed to reconstitute, according to Bourdieu, the field of American sociology as Goffman got to know it from the late 50s to the early 80s. So, according to Bourdieu, Goffman's life evolved in a field, professional field, sociology, and that field kept moving. It was not static. So you need to assemble the different layers. And within the layers, here was Goffman. So I also tried, in that respect, not only to follow Goffman's trajectory in the successive states of the field of sociology, I also tried to develop what historians call a prosopography, that is, a collective biography. That is the biography of all the Chicago PhDs in sociology around the late 50s. That is, all of Goffman's colleagues leaving Chicago, spreading all over the field of American sociology. And the question then was, how come there is only one Erving Goffman? Given the fact that all those colleagues were all provided with the same intellectual resources and the same opportunities. See, Bourdieu's demands are very, very high, but when you start thinking about that, they make sense. But the construction, to me, of the subway map, well, Bourdieu later was much criticized for that image of the subway map, but let's not go into that now, possibly later. But it was a very vivid image in order to say that there were predefined possible routes, and individuals then choose between different possibilities. But you have to map out the different possibilities for the different individuals. And then you try to understand why you specific individual selected that specific route. But my argument now is that the construction of a subway map is a biographical illusion, in the sense that it is just impossible to assemble it. The major problem I realized was that there was no clearly defined field. It was all too easy to consider that Goffman's trajectory was just across the field of American sociology. Not only Goffman moved in and out of it in order to explore venues in anthropology, in linguistics, in ethology, but I argue that his social identity was not bound by American social sciences for two reasons. One, he also stepped into European social sciences, if only by the translation of his books. And two, he moved beyond the social sciences, be they American or European, in order to become a figure, I would say, in different international fields: culture, media, public health. So at some point, how do you want me to reconstruct those different fields at different periods for different people? That's just staggering. I mean, you cannot do that. Anyway, I decided I could not. It was too grandiose an ambition. And therefore, I slowly decided that I would really do it differently. And I turned to a literary device to express my commitment to a constructed biography. I decided to work through fragments. Instead of writing a continuous narrative, I opted in several of my contributions towards a lifelong biography of Erving Goffman for snapshots, stills, postcards. That is, I started to rely on short but dense descriptions of meaningful moments in Goffman's life. And let me turn to my third section, actually. That is, I call it Fragments of a Composite Life. And I would like to start with an example. In a recent paper titled Erving Goffman, The Traveling Hermit, which was published in an Italian journal. I don't know whether it's fully available in Brazil, Biography. It's fully published in English now. Most papers are in English, more than Italian. But Pier Paolo Giglioli edited an issue called, as you might see, whoops, let me show you, Erving Goffman First 100 Years, which is cute. He asked me for a paper, and I wrote a paper arguing for a description of Goffman, not as a hermit, because very often Goffman is presented as a recluse, working almost exclusively from his home, either in Bethesda, Berkeley, or Philadelphia. So I collected data on the many lectures Goffman gave in the United States and abroad in order to suggest that Goffman is certainly not a hermit, or he is, as I said in my title, a traveling hermit. So I collected data. Once again, I went back to my interviews. I got some through archives. And finally, I digged out a few regularities in his appearances, such as his way of rebuking the photographers or playing nice guy when he was accepted as a regular member in a conference, for example, and playing bad boy when he was received as a godly figure. He just crossed what we could accept. In order to stuff as many elements in my short description as possible, I organized my paper as a set of postcards Goffman never sent home. And I sent, so to speak, those postcards from London, from Paris, from Brussels, from Germany, in different places. And as you probably know, Erving Goffman also came to Rio de Janeiro in October 1978, and Gilberto Velho told the story many times. It's published all over. Each postcard, each visit is about 1 page long, and it reads, so to speak, like a verbal photography. Who were his host, who was in the audience, how Goffman was dressed, how he went to the rostrum, how he read his paper, etc. There is a light chronological link between the photographs, but that may also stand as pictures of their own. And then in a later section, I try to show the patterns behind the descriptions. I would argue that it is not just a stylistic trick. What I'm trying to trigger here is some kind of a Kuleshov effect between the verbal images. And I'm just going to step out for a minute out of my paper because of Etienne Sama's being with us. Etienne asked me once to offer a seminar about that wonderful book, which is, let me show it, Balinese Character, and what by Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead. And if I can for a minute, and it's difficult to show to the screen, but I guess you see something. Yeah. It's made of several hundred pictures, which might be chronological, but most of them are more thematic or more formally organized. And what is most important, and I still remember arguing about that in Etienne's seminar, is the in-between the pictures. Because you, the reader, fill the slots. And you understand what's going on in Balinese culture thanks to the ways Bateson and Mead invites you to fill the blanks. And that's actually the strategy I have been following in writing snapshots. Another example, which might not be too well known, but I was very impressed by François Girard's documentary film called 32 brief films sur Glenn Gould. 32 films brefs sur Glenn Gould, the Canadian pianist, 1993. The film is made actually of 32 short films of 1 to 6 minutes for a total of 98 minutes about a famous piano player who actually ran several parallel lives, one of them being a stock trader besides being a pianist. And it's funny because Goffman was also a stock trader, but anyway. So the filmmaker led the viewer to understand that the several Goulds did not quite fit into each other, and that's probably true of each of us. But when you read a biography, a traditional biography, they all tend to smooth that out, and they tend to offer the reader too much of a unified view of the biography or of the subject. That's what I'm arguing against. Through using my snapshots, I am actually following Bourdieu's suggestion that a life is not just a slow stream of sequences or continuous events. It goes in all kinds of directions. And it's only later sometimes that the person might rationalize his life and making homogeneous. And Bourdieu says we should not adopt, for us scientists, the view of the biographer on his own or her own life. Just like you don't accept a priori the explanation of an interviewee. I mean, you just collect data and then you make your own sense out of what he or she told you. I would say that another important advantage of my fragmentary approach is to break away from a too overused mode of explanation, that is influences. When you read biographies, you always end up with influences. That is, influences of a parent, schooling, another book on the subject under study. When you think about it, there's actually no way of confirming influences, except when the biography, the subject, explicitly acknowledged the impact of that person, let's say a professor, of that school, or of that book. But even then, as I just said, why would we trust automatically the subject assertions? Is he or is she the best qualified to evaluate the influence on his or her work? But we may even leave that question aside. What I'm arguing here is that the far-spread biographical tradition of attributing loose causal links between whatever elements at hand and the work under scrutiny is to be critically questioned. I mean, let's say you find a book that he probably read or she probably read, and automatically there is going to be an assumption that his or her work was influenced by that book. No way. I mean, we all know that we cannot have been influenced by all the books in our own respective libraries. So that notion of influence has to be really questioned. The lazy domination of influences is even more spectacular in psychologically oriented biographies where incidents of childhood explain why the work contains such and such element. It is especially visible in biographies of writers and musicians, framed in vaguely or explicitly psychoanalytical traditions. But let's get out of that. So my approach, based on fragments, cut short on such influences. That might be real, but we have no way to prove them. So let's leave them out and let's focus on the events that might be properly documented. I would argue that their synecdochical qualities, the part for the whole, are sufficiently powerful to convey an impression of a whole, in spite of the fact that we purposefully stay short of explicitly expressing that whole. That is, I'm alluding that behind the details, there is a whole. The detail is sort of showing light on a bigger picture which is looming behind. But I have not the capacity to entirely paint or sketch the whole. And I'm using details in order to suggest the whole. Fourth step, that was, I said 25 minutes, actually I'm getting longer, all right? Anyway, that's usually the step. Where do I go from here? I have been trying to complete Goffman's biography for many years, if a biography can be said to ever be completed. In recent years, I have been working in close collaboration with a few other scholars. With Wendy, I actually wrote a book on Goffman. Here it is, not too well known, Erving Goffman, and a critical introduction to media and communication theory is barely visible. The layout is not too good. Anyway, I've been working also with Greg Smith, the British Goffman scholar, and we are still thinking, Greg and I, to complete one day a full biography. But I also have been exchanging a lot with a few other scholars, such as Rod Watson, the British ethnomethodologist, or Gary Jaworski. I believe in the virtue of dialogue to make progress in the researching and writing of an intellectual biography, but I also believe in parallel biographies. I mean, what I have in mind here is the excellent book by, probably not translated into Portuguese yet, Amin Perez, who wrote his dissertation on Bourdieu and Abdelmalek Sayad, and it was turned into a book this very year. It's called, as you might see, Combattre en sociologue, Pierre Bourdieu and Abdelmalek Sayad dans une guerre de libération, Algérie, 1958-1964. Confronting the young Bourdieu with the young Sayad in Algeria, critical elements of their respective personalities and trajectories are put forward in a very new light. It would be conceivable to build a similar dual biography with Erving Goffman and Howie Baker. Same generation, same training, same public aura. Looming over the work would be the question, how come Erving did not become Howie? How come Howie did not become Erving? So it is some kind of a reduced biography, a reduced collective biography, only two persons, sort of bouncing against each other, so to speak. I think that's the way to produce a well-built biography. If I am not able to ever complete that full biography, I think I will still resort to themes. For example, now that I have worked with a few leftover photographies of Erving Goffman, photography plays a very major role in his thinking. He was trained in Canada at the Canadian Film Board. He kept using photographs in his teaching. And as you know, he published a book of photographs, Gender Advertisements. That deserves a special paper. Maybe there's already one. Huh? I'm sure there's one somewhere, but I could still possibly write a paper on Bourdieu and photography. So to come to my conclusion, after all, I would say that only Bourdieu was able to conduct biographical work along the lines he developed in his 1986 paper. Remember his work on Flaubert, or even more spectacular, his work on Manet. Okay, look at the book, huh? No way I will ever achieve that. But there are also biographical work written in his perspective. See the work on Sartre by Anne Bocchetti, a bit forgotten today, but it's worth reading, or the work by Pascal Durand on Mallarmé. What we need, though, is a model biography in our field, in the social sciences, in sociology or anthropology. Sure, we could make transpositions from the literary and artistic field in terms of methods and analytical tools, but we might still hope for a biography grappling with the specificity of the scientific field, and even more so with the specificity of the social sciences field. I'm not saying that I'm going to offer you one day that model biography, but I'm still hoping to offer one day a biography that both offers a tribute to Erving Goffman and to the social sciences. Goffman deserves it, and the social sciences ought to be fully acknowledged for their crucial contribution. So, to summarize and end up, no biography, as far as I'm concerned, in the social sciences can just be written as a simple chronological narrative. It is a constructed object. I think you got the point. Thank you. Now, we have the rest of the night, as far as I'm concerned, or the rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, Yves. Many thanks for this very, not only very informative, but also very inspiring lecture. I would, now we are here, and I'm attentive to any questions and comments who might come from the audience. I know that they will be sent to us. But in the meantime, and I don't know, perhaps Etienne would also like to join us again here and also be seen. It would be nice to have him here with us. I don't know whether he is able to be here now. But anyway, I would like to start by actually posing you some questions after some comments, just for us to start a little bit the discussion. First of all, it's very nice that this Bourdieu text about the biographic illusion. It is very often used, not only in Brazil. It's very often used in our method courses, so social science method courses. So it's very nice. It's a nice way of attaching to the Brazilian audience too in your talk. But what I would like I have actually 3 questions to you based on your methodological choice regarding these snapshots. This, as you said, this fragmentary approach as to Erving Goffman's biography. No? The first I think I'd like to ask you, it's a little bit, you emphasized a lot that your choice has a lot to do with this dialogue with Bourdieu, with Bourdieu's texts, also with his suggestions, also Luc Boltanski's suggestions about the habitus and this role of class and the habitus and so on. But I was actually wondering if you could dwell a little bit more about, my impression was that this choice of yours has more to do with Goffman's work, than with a preconception you would have about Bourdieu's suggestion. Okay, Bourdieu has his suggestions and so on, but I think that there is, and me as a student of Goffman, as Goffman liked to say, and as students, he used this expression. For me, his work is a mosaic indeed. It is very visual, and it is very fragmentary too. That's why he had this very anarchic, we might say, role in sociology, because actually he approached many different. This is something Greg Smith also points out in his biography, in one of his books about Goffman. He says that he tested many different metaphors. Now the metaphors of dramaturgy, then the metaphor of the game, then the metaphor of the ritual, and so on. So, but what one sees is that it's not a linear procedure, because he always comes back to these. Obviously, he incorporates new things, ethology. Then afterward, and at the end, the frame analysis is totally visual and photographic too. This idea of frames and so on. And he dwells on Bateson's concept too of frames. So actually, what I was wondering is if you could a little bit because I think that you talk a lot about Bourdieu, but I think that Goffman suggested you this way of addressing. Because you know that there was this issue about trajectory. Bourdieu points this out, that there is this not get into the risk of conceiving that there is a linear biography. Everything is okay, but I think there is more to it than just Bourdieu. There is because I was actually a provocation you actually formulated for me was something like. You said, no, I cannot do, if we want to write biographies of social sciences, they are different from the ones from the ones of football, for example, players.
Yeah, right.
So I was wondering why. Does it have to do more with the social sciences or more with your approach? So actually, this is one question, and I would actually... and I was also thinking whether you could address or a little bit the way, for example, Norbert Elias has addressed biography in his amazing, unfortunately unfinished work on Mozart, in which he has a different approach to biography, but it is also as he says, this is not a biography of Mozart. So. And last but not least, the third question was really you were, because I work a lot on spaces, and especially Erving Goffman's conceptions of space, and I was wondering, the fact what you told at the beginning, that you really you followed Goffman's steps spatially. I would like to ask you, what this experience, did this experience change your understanding of Goffman's biography? This possibility of following him step by step in spatial terms. What do you think was this contribution, or wasn't there any contribution of this spatial approach to Goffman? Thanks.
Okay, well, gee, yeah, we could spend the rest of the night on those 4 or 3 questions. Right? That's for sure. By the way, speaking of the night, I better turn on the light.
Yeah.
And as usual, I'm going to move from bottom up.
Yeah.
That is Goffman in space. When I said that I spent time in the different places that must have been meaningful for Goffman, I presented them in a chronological order, which was not exactly the way I actually went through those different places. For example, I was at University of Pennsylvania from 1978 on. I mean, I kept going back to Penn. So I should not have gone to Penn before the end of my research, but no way. I did it when the opportunity was possible. Just to give you a small example of how living there was important for me in order to understand what Goffman was doing. That was when I spent just a few hours, because it was very difficult to be there for a longer time, in the mental hospital named St. Elizabeth in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
Goffman barely ever mentioned in asylums that the hospital was built in a huge park overlooking Washington, and that the park was actually very beautiful with many very big trees which had been planted by a former superintendent in the 19th century. He did not make much out of the fact that the asylum was also built on pavilions, and people had to move from one pavilion to the next. And doors were ringing each time a patient would get out of a pavilion, so that a nurse or whomever would be alerted that a patient was leaving the pavilion. I don't know why. He never mentioned that. And I think that did help me to understand his focus on specific proprieties, or whatever you call them, but not all of them. Same, for example, when I spent about a week in Unst, it kept raining for the 8 or 10 days I was there in the middle of August. So far as I know, in the dissertation, Goffman never mentioned that the weather was just atrocious, as if he was so much focused on interpersonal relations, communication conduct, or whatever he called it, that he never developed, I would not say a sensitivity, but he decided that it was not relevant to mention in his dissertation that it was raining all the time. And I found it was. I mean, that's what I stressed when I wrote a few papers on my visiting Unst. So yes, those experiences were very interesting negatively. That is, in order to understand what Goffman focused on and did not focus on. So that's one thing. As far as Norbert Elias, I have to say that I read it years ago, and finally, I won't be able to tell you much because I don't have it in mind right now. And I won't be able to say, okay, that's how Elias worked on his Mozart, and that's how Bourdieu worked on his Manet. But if there is a similarity, it is that willingness for social scientists working on quote unquote scientific biographies to sort of deconstruct the very, as you just said, linear biography, the naturally chronological biography. I might have been over arguing my case alongside Bourdieu.
No, I'm just asking Ricardo whether there are any questions of the public.
It's not a sub question you're asking me. Okay.
No, sorry.
Now, if we move up, you're right. I did not realize, first question, how much I was possibly unconsciously influenced by Goffman's very way of writing through snapshots, or even look at gender advertisements. I mean, it's full of pictures. I mean, it's almost explicitly based on Balinese character. At the same time, I'm referring to Balinese character. Sure, Etienne is here, but I would have done it, and I did it in other circumstances where I explicitly acknowledged the influence of Balinese character on my way of thinking in terms of snapshots, but I never referred to gender advertisements in order to say that's also a way of setting up plenty of pictures in order to abstract patterns out of them. Yeah, it is surprising. You are very right. Goffman kept writing in a mosaic way. He might have been influenced, I alluded to it, by his, that would be his scientific habitus, if we have to refer to that, because he was visually trained at the National Film Board in Canada around 1944. So he saw many, many documentary films. And I still remember Ray Birdwhistle, who was my master's degree advisor, and who happened to be Erving Goffman's first anthropology professor at the University of Toronto in 1944, telling me you should never forget that Goffman is a documentary filmmaker in writing.
Wow.
It was a very nice way of putting it. That is, Goffman, you got it. I mean, he writes, but it is as if he was shooting, as if he was editing and projecting documentary films.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, my snapshots are a way of doing that. I have to say, frankly, that I'm a bit rationalizing and post-arguing what used to be first more of a way of telling stories through small segments.
Mm-hmm.
A bit like in anthropology when you excerpt quotes or images out of your diary, or that's what you say your reader, maybe it's rearranged, but that's the way you present your discourse. You do it through snapshots, somehow connected, somehow disconnected. And I think I first proceeded that way. And then I realized that it was a way to respond to Bourdieu's argument about the willingness to show the discontinuity, the necessity of showing that a biography was necessarily discontinuous. So
Mm-hmm.
through the use of fragments, I was sort of respecting Bourdieu's invitation. In the meantime, I neglected a far more obvious influence, Goffman's own way of writing through snapshots, details, which were very meaningful. As I said at the very end, there is some kind of the word is difficult to say, synecdotal, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is, you take the part for the whole.
Mm-hmm.
You assume that the reader is going to understand that the detail is not just words for the sake of a detail. It is words for what it tells about the entire picture, the whole. And Goffman has very often been working that way as well. And
Exactly.
that's the way I have been writing myself, but without calling Goffman at the rescue. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's more fancy to call Bourdieu at my rescue than Goffman, or I divided the work. Goffman is my empirical body of data, and Bourdieu is my theoretical framework.
Yes, exactly. No, and I was actually thinking, because you were thinking, you were addressing Balini's character, but Goffman himself addresses Bateson
Oh yeah,
mainly in frame analysis. And you could perhaps, and as you say, that you have a big collection on Goffman's photos or dealing with photography and so on. I think this book may be in my opinion, this book may be the one that offers you the way of addressing this biography you understand, like something like after Bellamy's character, Goffmanian character,
yeah.
something like this.
Look, there is also something very intriguing, and I haven't been able to really make sense out of his repulsion for photographies. I mean, he always forbade people
Exactly.
to take his
Take
photograph without his explicit consent.
Yeah.
So there are a few pictures where he poses, but there are very few of them. I mean, possibly half a dozen at the most. There are a few stolen photographs, usually fairly bad. And then there are pictures that ultimately were never taken out of the camera. I mean, he was, for example, at the Fenton Lectures at the University of Buffalo. He admitted the photographs for a few minutes, and then I got those 3 pictures, and I'm going to publish them in October in a small book on Bourdieu, on Goffman as a performance. And after 3 minutes, another photographer showed up, and he just stopped his lecture, went down the rostrum, and said, "You get out of here." And the photographer was so panicked that he dropped his camera, and we never got the photograph that were inside the camera.
Wow.
So why was he so brutal?
Yeah.
After photographers, for example, Wendy discovered in the archive of the University of Pennsylvania that he was very irritated because one of his pictures had been used for one of the university magazines without his explicit content. And the administrator of that magazine said that he had never seen that in 20 years, that a professor would be grumpy about his being photographed and used. So there's some kind of a nod there. Goffman and photography is not easy to unravel, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, in my opinion, it has a lot to do with the extreme sensitivity he had for understanding this social phenomenon, which is social interaction. The guy, he is in my opinion the sociologist who most in most detailed way entered this realm of social interaction, which was now, as he mentioned it at the end of his life, so interaction order. And I think so. And his attention to regarding rules of conduct and so on, he was very sensitive to that, and so everything was involved in rules of conduct, even photography, because it's.
I try, as I said, I try to stay away from a psychological interpretation of repulsion for photographs, but I think he understood very well how a photography was able to catch the social persona.
Exactly.
So in terms of his theory of identity and self, a photograph is more than a photograph, especially since it is ambulatory, so to speak. It is very mobile. And he wants to have control over that mobile self, which is the photograph,
Exactly. And I was actually in this context, now I've just recovered. I don't know where I read that, but that the photograph that appears in the presentation of life and of self and everyday life, this photo of the 3 ladies. Do you know this black and white photo that appears in the original North American?
I didn't bring it.
But what I read it somewhere that he decided that he wanted that this photo appears in the original covers of the book.
That could well be.
Specifically this photo.
Yeah, that would fit nicely with what you just said, and we try to figure out about the very sociological, symbolic importance of photographs for Erving Goffman. I mean, he never took photographs in his field, so far as I know, possibly in Balthasar. I mean, in the island of Uns, apparently he had a camera, but I was never able to dig out the photographs. And from there on, I don't think he took photographs as we usually or casually do. In the same way, remember that he never permitted his students to conduct interviews. He did not trust interviews, as if he wanted only to rely on his own grabbing or collecting. But he was not going to let an informant to tell him a truth or whatever. He thought that an informant was going to be leading the sociologist wherever he wanted it, and he didn't want that. He wanted, again, to stay in control. And I guess possibly the very autonomy of a photography would escape his control.
Exactly.
There would be a line of inquiry to be pushed.
Yeah, no,
further, right?
it's really no. I think you offered a kind of. It's actually a gate, a key into Goffman's in your attempt to write the Goffman biography. I think perhaps this way using photography as a way, the way he uses photography, his claims about photography and so on.
As an analyzer. But you correctly mentioned Greg Smith's book a few years ago. I mean, he has been very keen on that issue as well. And for years, we have been working together trying to share, for example, our data. And that was at some point quite useful because, for example, all of my interviews were on tiny little magnetic tapes, and he offered to digitalize them.
Wow, how nice.
He saves them, thanks God.
How nice, Yves. Let me now just check here whether there are any other questions or comments. I don't know. I'm waiting for any information by the technical staff, Ricardo or Ramiro. Because if not, I would actually, considering even the time, no? We have been here for 1.5 hours. I would perhaps a last actually comment or question to you would be if you could. You said that at the beginning that you would very generously share with us your sources, the sources you used for your lecture. I think this could be interesting, or for your conference. I think that could be.
Actually, I mentioned several times Pierre Bourdieu, that's for sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I also mentioned Os momentos oh my God, I will not.
Os momentos e seus homens, the moment and this.
Now, I also used a lot of a paper called Erving Goffman, What is a Life? The Uneasy Making of an Intellectual Biography. It is a paper published in a book edited by Greg Smith, Goffman and Social Organization, Studies in a Sociological Legacy in 1999. For the first time, I started to try to understand what I was doing and trying to explain in a rather reflexive and critical way that I was sometimes in a cul-de-sac, that I had to backtrack, and I had to go in some kind of another direction, or that Bourdieu's frame was just too grandiose and I had to back out of it, etc. Now, I also use tonight, but very much in the background, it's a short paper, Goffman Erving. It's an entry in that dictionary with a nice picture of Bourdieu. You might know it, vocabulary, authentic. It's a Bourdieu vocabulario. It's an entry on Goffman that I wrote, and I stressed the relationship between Goffman and Bourdieu, how the two persons knew each other, respected each other, how Bourdieu ended up translated 7 books by Goffman, so that now Goffman is probably the best translated American sociologist, or the most translated American sociologist or Canadian sociologist or English-speaking sociologist in France. And you might think that Bourdieu's sociology does not fit with Goffman's sociology. Well, Giselle Sapiro will address that issue at the end of the seminar, and I'm sure that she's going to show how actually the two sociologies were, in a sense, complementary. They respect each other, but more than that, they mesh into each other, I think, more than fight against each other. Then another source I mentioned it is Goffman, the Traveling Hermit in Ethnographia, where I really try to systematically use that technique or approach by the postcard, the snapshot. And I just mentioned a book which is certainly not translated because it's only going to be published in October. It's called d'Erving Goffman, une œuvre performée.
Mhm.
What I'm trying to argue there, I actually worked again on his lectures, but I pushed the issue of his work as a performance. Remember that he wrote a paper called The Lecture,
Mhm.
which actually was a lecture turned into a paper titled The Lecture. So there are several embedded realities in that very paper. There's the verbal, the behavioral performance of which we don't have a tape, so far as I know. But we can imagine the way he addressed his audience, because I was able to interview a few people who happened to attend a few of his lectures. He was very stern, very rigid, very
Mhm.
focused on his paper. He was not spectacular in any way. But in that book, I try to argue that it may well have been his way of being spectacular that is not being spectacular. In a sense, he was very akin to those performing artists who became fairly well known in the late 20 years, artists who actually perform, sometimes perform lectures,
Mhm.
sometimes perform silently. And one of the intellectual source might be John Cage. And I try to show that
Mm.
there's some kind of a link, I would not say,
My God.
between John Cage and Goffman, because Goffman fairly often alludes to John Cage in a mock way, but still, he does know the guy and his work, that's for sure.
How interesting.
So my interpretation in that little book is, as I say in the subtitle, une œuvre performée. Is Goffman's work a performed work? That is, the more he produced lectures, the more Irving became Goffman, the more he became a public character, the more it was expected from him, not that he would trash the camera, because very few people knew that from one event to the next, but he was becoming a celebrity.
Mhm.
And my argument, given the fact that he wrote a paper like The Lecture, he was extremely self conscious of what he was doing.
Mhm.
So you might really argue that he was performing. He was not just acting out without realizing what he was doing. He knew, as far as I'm sure or concerned or alerted to the fact, he knew what he was doing. And then you might argue that next to the written work, you have an oral work, a performing work. And it would be interesting to dig out even more lectures in order to understand, I would say, another Goffman, which is just next to the written Goffman, but which is quite interesting to investigate in its own right. So,
Mm.
I mean, I was invited to write a short book, and I didn't need to be long, but it is an invitation to keep, I would say, digging in
Mhm.
that direction. And in a sense, to explore all the possibilities of the notion of performance, of
Mhm.
which range is huge. I mean, from philosophy to linguistics to performance studies to performance in the artistic field, performance is everywhere. And you might find links between those different performances. And I would argue that Goffman, when you look at Goffman's lectures, you have a way to use performance in the pragmatic or philosophical sense, but you also have a way to use performance in linguistic, if not in the artistic senses. So it's very rich, and it's a very interesting analytical tool,
Mhm.
and Goffman's oral work.
But I think then, based on what we've discussed here, I think the next step would really be to address how photography and the use he does of photography
Yeah,
links to this concept of performance
yeah.
you've
maybe
detected in his work.
you might
And his
consider,
written and lecture work.
if you consider a photograph as a still performance, or as
Exactly.
a frozen performance, or a fragment of a performance, then you have a link to
Exactly. And the
so,
challenges, as you said, because the photography, it escapes it at the same. On one side it is performance, on the other side it escapes any possibility of performance.
yeah.
No?
But look, Goffman never allowed a photographer to take one of his live lectures or to take photographs during his lectures. He admitted to be photographs before, but not during and not after.
Wow.
So you're right. I mean, there's something there.
Yeah, there's something there. This is the next book, Yves.
Yeah, sure. Always one more book.
Oh, Yves, look, I'm looking at the clock now, and we have 1 hour, 1.5 hours of discussion. It has been wonderful, a privilege for me to have this exchange with you today. It was really, really very nice. And I would like to remember that you talk about your next book, but I would like to recall that both of us are in a book, a Goffman Handbuch, which is being published here in Germany this year.
Oh yeah, right.
You contributed with a biography, with a biographical issue, and I have just contributed with Goffman spatial concepts. So another way of meeting.
I just got notification today that Springer is going to send the book. So
yeah, exactly. So Yves, many thanks. I'm really happy about this meeting, and also a meeting with Etienne Samin, and I'm very happy that you met again through Goffman, through me and Goffman. So after such a long time. I'm really happy. Many thanks. I would like to ask you if you want to say anything now as a closing words or something like this.
If it is a closing word, I mean, what we have been doing is a real seminar. That is, you have been offering suggestions I never thought about, let's say, photography and performance, for example, or photography as an analyzer, or photography as a way of interrogating or scrutinizing snapshots. And that's where the work in progress of a seminar shows its best qualities, heuristically speaking. So thank you so much.
No, I'm very happy.
Yeah, it was.
Let's meet another time for you to tell me what you found out.
Yeah. Okay, and I will have to acknowledge in the bottom line that it started. Thank you so much.
How nice, Yves. Many thanks. I would also like to thank to everyone who has joined us here during this afternoon in Brazil and evening here in Europe. I would also like to thank Ramiro for his translation, simultaneous translation. Also thank Ricardo Cioldin for his support at Unicamp. Also Etienne Samin's appearance here. He has gone, but the fact that he was here with us was very nice. And I would also like to thank to all the organization team, of which I'm a part, as the conceptual organization team of this seminar. We will keep on in our seminar series until late 2022, and in August next week, in 2 weeks, we start a little mini-curso, a little mini course in Portuguese about Goffman's different facets of Goffman's work. Brazilian professors will do that. I will give my talk on Wednesday, the 5th or the 4th. The 4th, I think, or the 3rd. I don't know. I have to have it. No, 3rd, exactly. 3rd of August, 2022. So bye-bye to everyone. Yves, many thanks.
Oh, my pleasure.
It was a pleasure. And
for sure.
Let's hope to meet again soon, as soon as possible. Yes? Have a nice evening and bye.
Okay, goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.